2047 जब आजादी के 100 साल होंगे, आजादी के दीवानों के सारे सपने पूरे करने का जिम्मा उठा करके चलना होगा। बहुत बड़े संकल्प लेकर के चलना होगा, और वो बड़ा संकल्प है विकसित भारत। अब उससे कुछ कम नहीं होना चाहिए।
On Independence Day, as India turns 75, Prime Minister Narendra Modi has set an ambitious target for the country. He has said that India should resolve to become a developed country in the next 25 years. So by 2047, that's the target for India. Let's have a look at some of the charts that explain where India is currently, how far it has come since independence, and how far it has to go to achieve that ambitious target. So let's start by first looking at gross domestic product. Now, typically, this is the thing that defines what a high-income country or a developed country is. And as you can see in the chart, India's map has GDP has increased a lot from where we started off. We are around $2.5 trillion economy. However, if you compare it to countries like China, we are a long way behind. It is important to note here in the chart that India and China's GDP were roughly in the same range in the 1970s and 80s. But from there onwards, China has leapfrogged. And within a couple of decades, its GDP was twice our size, and today it's almost 5 times our size. So that shows you the distance that India has to cover, because China is still not formally would perhaps be called a developed country. You have also on the chart the United States, which is the biggest economy, and there you can see the distance between India and the US, or India and the Chinese economy. The second chart that I would like to focus on is GDP per capita, because this is another thing that actually defines a developed country. Often it is seen that an economy like India has a huge GDP, primarily because we are a big country, we're a lot of people, but the standards of living are relatively poor, and that is what is captured by GDP per capita. So if you look at this chart, you'll find that India's GDP per capita is actually next to just Pakistan. And the GDP per capita of countries like United Kingdom, which we are about to beat in aggregate GDP, we are about to beat United Kingdom. But when it comes to GDP per capita, we are far behind them. And similarly with the United States, again, the developed nations, or even South Korea, look at the GDP per capita. Another metric that needs to be looked at is median income. And this sort of captures the inequality in a society. Ideally, you would want in a developed country, inequalities will be lower and poverty levels would be lower. Now, median income is another way to look at average incomes. Median income looks at that level of income behind which half the population of the country is. And so it gives you a sense of the distributional difference also. And as you can see, India is even below Pakistan in that, whereas US and United Kingdom, South Korea are much, much ahead. So they're more equal societies. The lower half of the society or the economy obviously earns less than the top half, but the difference is lesser so. Whereas in India, it's quite stark. So the next thing that we need to look at is poverty levels. Now, again, as this chart shows, India's poverty level has fallen quite remarkably from around just under 60% of our population living in abject poverty in early 80s to roughly around 10% at the current juncture. But you also have to look at where the developed countries are. And those are seeing absolutely negligible levels of poverty in the chart. What is also quite remarkable in this is to learn what China has done which started off with almost 90% poverty levels, much higher than ours, but it has brought them down to almost developed country levels. And that is another thing that we need to learn if we want to catch up with the developed world. And as a consequence of this, often percentages do not capture this, but this particular graphic shows the kind of burden that we are talking about when we talk about poverty. India, as of 2013, and that is still a decade ago, had 218 million people who were poor, living in extreme poverty. So India was home, or is home, to the largest number of poor people in the world. And since 2013, we actually haven't had surveys to figure out what happened to our poverty, but unofficial estimates suggest that poverty levels have actually risen in terms of the absolute number of people living in extreme poverty have risen because of deceleration in economic growth and the COVID pandemic. Next, we want to look at something that is called the Human Development Index. And we want to move away from the monetary measures and look at some of the other aspects of an economy. And typically, you would find that Human Development Index is where a developed country really scores huge. In this chart, where we map the Human Development Index, you'll see Norway or United States, United Kingdom, South Korea really at the top. The HDI is essentially a composite of the health of your citizens, the education that they receive, and the standard of living. So it's a composite index, and that's why it's so robust. And here you see that India has again made massive strides. It has had a secular improvement right through the last 3-4 decades, yet it is far behind what you would call a developed country level. For example, if you just look at where India is as of the latest figures, it would be similar to where, say, an Indonesia was in the late 90s, or where even a Brazil was in early 90s, or where maybe a South Korea was in the early 1980s. So that just shows how far we have to go and how many more years it might take to really achieve the levels of developed country standards. Another crucial metric that we want to look at is the malnourished population, the undernourished population. As you know that in India, there's also the highest stock of children who are malnourished. And if we look at this chart, which sort of maps the number of people in an economy who are undernourished, and it's all people, not just the children, you'll see that India is quite in an abject position. We had roughly around 200 million people living with who were undernourished. And if you compare it to forget the developed world, even some of the developing countries, say China or Brazil, is just not comparable. So we have a long way to go to ensure that our population is better nourished. And lastly, we'd like to focus on something that doesn't often get as much attention, which is the status of women, and more particularly the economic empowerment of women, the economic freedoms that they have. This is a chart which tracks the female employment to population ratio, how many women are employed relative to population. And as you can see, India is at the absolute bottom here. India's for this ratio, the involvement of women in the economy has actually fallen since 2005, 2004, 5, quite sharply. So, at a stage where the economy has actually grown faster, that number has actually come down, the involvement of women. And today it stands at one of the abysmal levels, lowest amongst the any country in the world, and almost half of what you would expect would be the global average, and maybe 1/3 of what you would expect in a developed country. So, which is to say that only 20% of Indian women are who are part of the economy, as it were. And this is both the problem area for India and also where the solution lies. If India can solve this hurdle and ensure that its women have economic empowerment, then perhaps that is where India's growth and development metrics may start rivaling those of the developed world. Thank you.